They thought they could turn my home into their free hotel and treat me like unpaid staff. I'm Darlene Gable, 59, a retired county probate clerk. When my son and his wife showed up with a list of rules, they forgot I spent 30 years filing the documents that can strip a person's roof away. The wind coming off Lake Erie always has a bite to it in late October, the kind that rattles the loose storm windows of my modest two-bedroom bungalow here in Lorain, Ohio. I was just settling into bed, the electric blanket hum warming my aching lower back, a parting gift from 3 decades of hauling heavy, leather-bound deed books in the basement of the county courthouse. My eyes were half closed, the television murmuring a soft, black-and-white rerun when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite ring. It was a frantic, demanding series of buzzes that made my heart jump into my throat. I threw on my faded chenille robe, the one with the frayed cuffs I've mended twice with yellow thread, and hurried down the creaking wooden stairs. My mind raced through the worst-case scenarios. Was it my neighbor Bernice having another one of her dizzy spells? Had there been an accident down on Henderson Drive? When I unlocked the heavy oak deadbolt and pulled the door open, the chill air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp leaves and car exhaust. Standing on my porch, framed by the yellow glow of the porch light, was my 31-year-old son, Jason, and his wife, Chloe. At their feet sat 2 massive, hard-shell designer suitcases in a shade of aggressive rose gold. "Mom, thank God you're awake," Jason said, pushing past me into the narrow hallway without waiting for an invitation. He didn't hug me. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just hauled the first heavy suitcase over the threshold, scraping the bottom of my freshly painted baseboard. Chloe followed him, her nose immediately wrinkling as she stepped onto my braided rug. She was wrapped in a plush wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly pension check, her manicured hand clutching a sleek leather designer tote. "We had to break our lease," Jason announced, his voice carrying that familiar defensive pitch he always got when he'd made a mess of things. "The landlord raised the rent again, and frankly, we're tired of throwing money away. We need to save for a down payment on a real house, a place with a yard in a nicer zip code. So, we're moving in." I stood there, my hand still resting on the cold brass doorknob, staring at my only child. "Moving in?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Jason, you didn't call. You didn't write. You just showed up." "Oh, come on, Darlene," Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. She set her tote bag on my small telephone table, right on top of the lace doily my mother had crocheted. "It's not like you're using the space. You're retired. You're just rattling around in this old place by yourself. Besides, we're doing you a favor. It'll be nice for you to have some life in the house again." I looked at Jason, waiting for him to say something, to offer some shred of filial respect. But he just avoided my eyes, busy lining up the suitcases against my living room wall. I know some of you reading this are shaking your heads right now. You're thinking, "Darlene, why didn't you just point your finger at the door and tell them to get the hell out?" But if you've ever loved a child, if you've ever spent your nights sewing patches onto their jeans and skipping lunch so they could go on a school field trip, you know how hard it is to lock them out in the cold. I raised Jason alone after his father walked out when Jason was just 7. I did it on a county clerk's salary, counting every penny, stretching every pound of ground beef with oatmeal. He was my boy. Even when he grew up and started looking at my modest life with a quiet sort of embarrassment, he was still my boy. "The spare room isn't really set up," I said softly, trying to find my footing. "There's just the old double bed, and I use the closet for my winter coats." "We'll manage," Chloe said dismissively. She reached into her leather tote and pulled out a crisp, folded sheet of heavy cardstock. She slid it across the table toward me. "But since we're going to be sharing a space, we need to establish some ground rules. We both work very high-stress jobs, Darlene, and we can't have our routines disrupted. I'm sure you understand." I picked up the paper. It was printed in a sleek, modern font. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Household Expectations and Routines." My eyes scanned the bullet points, my chest tightening with every line. Breakfast must be prepared and ready on the table by 6 a.m. daily. Egg whites, avocado, organic dark roast coffee. No white bread or processed sugar in the house. Bathrooms must be thoroughly scrubbed and sanitized every night to maintain hygiene standards. All laundry must be processed immediately. Jason's work shirts must be starched and pressed. Chloe's silk blouses and dresses must be hung on padded hangers, never folded. Quiet hours are strictly enforced between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. No television, radio, or kitchen activity during these times. The common areas must remain free of clutter. Personal trinkets, old knickknacks, and outdated decor should be stored away to maintain a clean, minimalist aesthetic. I read the list twice. My hands, worn and spotted with the marks of age, began to tremble slightly. They weren't asking for a place to stay while they got back on their feet. They were hiring a maid, only they weren't planning on paying her a single dime. They were treating my home, the home I had spent 30 years of sweat, tears, and meager paychecks to fully own, as their private, rent-free resort, and treating me like the help. "You want me to scrub the bathrooms every night?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well, yes," Chloe said, as if she were explaining something to a slow child. "I have a very sensitive immune system, and this house, well, let's be honest, Darlene, it's old. It has that damp smell. We need to make sure everything is kept pristine. And Jason needs his shirts looking perfect for his client meetings. It's only fair, since we're going to be living under the same roof." "Fair," I murmured. "We're going to get some sleep now," Jason said, finally looking at me, though he couldn't quite hold my gaze for more than a second. "We have a big day tomorrow. Make sure the coffee is hot by 6, Mom. I have a presentation at 8. They picked up their rose gold suitcases and began carrying them up the narrow stairs, their heavy footsteps shaking the ceiling above my head. I stood in my quiet kitchen for a long time after the bedroom door clicked shut upstairs. The refrigerator hummed its familiar, comforting tune. On the counter sat my old cast-iron skillet, seasoned to a perfect glossy black over decades of cooking Sunday breakfasts. Next to it was my faded green ledger book, where I still wrote down every utility bill, every grocery receipt, and every penny of my pension. Across the driveway, a light flickered on in Bernice's kitchen. A moment later, my phone buzzed on the counter. "Everything okay, Dar?" Saw headlights and suitcases. Bernice. I stared at the screen. I wanted to text her back and pour my heart out. I wanted to tell her that my son, the boy she used to buy popsicles for, had just handed me a list of chores in my own home. But a strange, cold calm was beginning to settle over me. It was the same feeling I used to get at the courthouse when a complicated, messy estate file landed on my desk, the kind where greedy relatives tried to swindle a grieving widow. I never got angry back then. I just got quiet. I studied the law, I looked at the deeds, and I found the exact spot where the greedy made their mistake. I looked down at the cardstock list of expectations still resting on my kitchen table. Chloe wanted breakfast ready by 6 a.m. She wanted the bathrooms scrubbed. She wanted a minimalist aesthetic. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my late husband's old brass pocket watch. I wound it slowly, listening to the steady, rhythmic click-click-click of the gears. I didn't cry. I didn't wring my hands. I just smiled a small, quiet smile that they never saw coming. They thought because I was old, because I wore cardigans and lived in a drafty house, that I was weak. They thought my love for my son made me blind. But they forgot one very important thing. A probate clerk spent her entire life watching people try to steal what wasn't theirs, and she knew exactly how to make them pay for every single inch they took. I pulled my faded green ledger out of the drawer, opened it to a fresh, clean page, and began to write. At exactly 5:45 the next morning, the cold October wind was still howling against the siding, but my kitchen was about to become very, very warm. At exactly 6 a.m., the kitchen was cold, but the coffee was hot. It wasn't the organic, dark-roasted, single-origin bean Chloe had demanded on her high-status list. It was Folgers, the classic red plastic tub I've bought at the Meijer on Cooper Foster Park Road for the last 20 years. I had brewed it in my 12-cup drip machine, the one with the stained glass carafe that has a tiny chip on the spout. I sat at my worn pine kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a faded mug that read, "World's Greatest Clerk," a retirement gift from the girls in the probate office. I had a single slice of white toast spread with store-brand salted butter resting on a chipped Corelle plate. The heavy, rhythmic thud of heels on the stairs signaled Chloe's descent. She appeared in the archway, already fully dressed in a tailored charcoal pantsuit, her hair slicked back into a perfect, unforgiving bun. She stopped, her eyes immediately darting to the table, then to the counter, and finally to me. "Where is the avocado toast, Darlene?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of any morning warmth. "And I don't smell the dark roast." I explicitly noted that we do not put processed white bread or cheap coffee in our bodies. It ruins Jason's focus for his morning meetings. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The warmth spread down my throat, grounding me. "Good morning, Chloe," I said, keeping my tone as soft as a Sunday morning breeze. "The coffee in that pot is what I have. If you'd like something different, the Giant Eagle down the road opens at 6. You're welcome to drive over and purchase whatever suits your palate." Her jaw tightened. I watched the tiny muscle near her ear twitch, a telltale sign of someone who was used to intimidating administrative assistants and service workers. Before she could speak, Jason shuffled into the kitchen. He looked tired, his eyes red-rimmed, his expensive silk tie hanging untied around his neck like a deflated snake. "Mom," he groaned, rubbing his face. "Did you press my white shirt? The one with the French cuffs? I need to look sharp today. We're meeting with a major developer." I pointed a calm finger toward the corner of the kitchen, where my old iron sat cold on the ironing board, its cord wrapped neatly around its base. "The iron is right there, Jason. The starch is in the cupboard under the sink. I suggest you get started. It takes a few minutes to heat up." Jason stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as if I had spoken to him in a foreign language. "But, Mom, the list. Chloe gave you the list last night. We discussed this. We're living under the same roof now, and we need to work as a team." "A team," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air between us. I looked at the two of them, my son, whom I had carried for 9 months and shielded from every harsh wind of life, and his wife, who looked at my home as if it were a dirty shoe she'd accidentally stepped in. A team implies mutual support, Jason, not a master-servant dynamic. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a busy day ahead. I stood up, washed my mug in the sink, dried it with a checkered dish towel, and walked upstairs to get dressed. I could hear them whispering furiously in the kitchen below, their voices sharp and urgent, but I didn't stop to listen. I didn't need to. I already knew the music they were playing. I just needed to find the sheet music to prove they were playing out of tune. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever sat across from someone you loved more than life itself, and realized they saw you as nothing more than a stepping stone? It's a quiet kind of heartbreak. It doesn't scream. It just settles deep in your chest, cold and heavy, like wet cement. But once it hardens, it becomes a foundation. And that morning, my foundation was solid. By 8:30 a.m., their expensive SUV had screeched out of my gravel driveway, leaving behind the smell of burnt rubber and a heavy silence. I didn't waste a single second. I walked up the stairs to the guest room, the room that had been Jason's bedroom when he was a boy, back when his biggest worry was whether he'd make the middle school baseball team. Now, it was cluttered with their hard-shell rose gold suitcases, designer garment bags, and a portable standing desk Jason had already set up. On the desk sat a sleek leather briefcase, left unlocked. Next to it was a small, wire wastebasket. I looked down and saw several crumpled pieces of heavy bond paper. 30 years of filing probate cases teaches you that people are incredibly careless with their trash. They think because they've thrown something away, it ceases to exist. But to a clerk, trash is a trail of breadcrumbs. I reached down and pulled out the crumpled papers, smoothing them out on the bed. They were printouts of financial statements and emails. My eyes, trained to spot discrepancies in estate valuations, immediately locked onto the numbers. There was a letter from a property management company in downtown Cleveland. It wasn't a friendly lease termination agreement. It was a notice to vacate for non-payment of rent. They owed 3 months of back rent on their luxury high-rise apartment, nearly $9,000. But it was the second document that made my blood run cold. It was a draft of a loan application for a commercial mortgage, dated just 3 weeks ago. Under the section titled Assets and Collateral, my address was listed, my home. The 200-square-foot bungalow my late husband Arthur and I had bought in 1988 for $42,000. The home I had paid off dollar by dollar, working overtime shifts, skipping vacations, and counting every dime. According to the loan document, Jason and Chloe were claiming a beneficial interest in my property, listing its estimated value at $280,000 and citing me as a dependent occupant with diminished capacity. Diminished capacity. They were planning to use my home, the only real asset I had, the roof over my head, as collateral for their next business venture. And to do it, they were preparing to argue that I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a deep, primal anger that started in the soles of my feet and rushed up to my chest. They hadn't come here because they wanted to save for a down payment. They had come here because they were drowning in debt, and they saw me as a life raft they could sink to keep themselves afloat. I folded the papers carefully and slid them into the pocket of my cardigan. "Not on my watch," I whispered to the empty room. I grabbed my purse, my car keys, and my worn leather folder. I drove down to the Lorain County Justice Center on Court Street in Elyria. The familiar smell of old paper, floor wax, and administrative anxiety washed over me as I walked through the heavy glass doors. It felt like coming home. I bypassed the main lobby and took the elevator down to the basement, where the archives and public records were kept. The girls behind the counter, women I had trained, women who had cried with me when Arthur passed away, looked up and smiled. "Darlene!" called out Myra, a sharp-witted woman in her late 50s who had taken over my old desk. "What are you doing here? We thought you were busy enjoying your retirement and sleeping in." "I have a little personal research to do, Myra," I said, offering her a warm, practiced smile. "Just checking on some old filings. Can I get access to the terminal in the back?" "For you?" "Always." "Go on through," she said, buzzing the security door open. I sat down at the familiar terminal, the green screen reflecting in my glasses. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I didn't start with my house. I started with Jason and Chloe's names in the civil court docket. What I found was a treasure trove of financial ruin. Chloe had 3 active credit card judgments against her, totaling over $38,000. Jason's consulting firm, which he always spoke of with such grand, sweeping gestures, was currently suspended by the state of Ohio for failure to pay corporate franchise taxes. But the real prize, the document that gave me the leverage I needed, was filed in the probate court database just 2 days ago. It was a petition for the appointment of a guardian, drafted by a local attorney who was known for handling discreet family estate matters for a high fee. The petition named me, Darlene Gable, as the ward. Attached to it was a forged medical evaluation form bearing a photocopied signature of my primary care physician, claiming I was suffering from early-stage cognitive decline. They had already started the paperwork to strip me of my legal rights. They were just waiting for the right moment to file it, to present me with a fait accompli while they took control of my house and my modest pension. I sat there in the quiet basement of the courthouse. The hum of the server racked the only sound in the room. I felt a single tear slip down my cheek. It was a tear for the little boy who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street, the boy who used to ask me to tuck him in at night. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who was willing to declare his own mother incompetent just to save his own skin. I wiped the tear away with the back of my hand. I printed every single document, the judgments, the eviction notice, the forged guardianship petition, the tax suspension. I organized them chronologically, punching holes in the side of each sheet and placing them into my green ledger binder, securing them behind a set of neat yellow tab dividers. I knew the law. I knew the exact steps they were trying to take, and I knew how to block them. But I didn't want to just block them. I wanted to teach them a lesson they would never, ever forget. When I drove back to Lorain, the sky was a heavy, bruised purple, promising rain. I pulled into my driveway and saw Bernice standing on her porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, watching my house. As soon as I shut my car door, she hurried across the damp grass, her eyes wide with concern. "Dar," she whispered, looking up at my second-story windows. "I saw them screaming at each other in the driveway this morning before they left. What is going on?" I took Bernice's hand. It was warm and rough from decades of working in the local school cafeteria. "Come inside, Bernice," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I have some paperwork to show you, and then we're going to make some phone calls." We sat at my kitchen table, the yellow legal pad between us, as I laid out the contents of my green ledger. Bernice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she read the forged guardianship petition. They want to lock you away, Dar," she breathed, her eyes filling with tears. "Your own son. They want my house, Bernice," I said, my voice cold and clear as lake ice. "But they forgot who built it." Bernice sat at my kitchen table, her fingers tracing the worn edge of her coffee mug. The rain had finally started, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the kitchen window that sounded like a countdown. She looked at the forged guardianship petition, her face pale under the soft yellow light of my ceiling fixture. "Darlene," she whispered, her voice trembling, "this is evil. There's no other word for it. How can Jason do this to you, after everything you gave up for him?" "Greed is a hungry thing, Bernice," I said, setting a fresh pot of chamomile tea on the table. "It doesn't care about memories. It doesn't care about who held your hand when you had the croup. Once it takes hold, it just looks for things to consume. And right now, they think I'm an easy meal." I sat down next to her, pulling my yellow legal pad toward me. "If I fight them openly right now, they'll panic. They'll rush to a judge with that forged medical evaluation before I can get my footing. In my 30 years at the courthouse, I've seen it 100 times. The person who screams the loudest usually looks the most guilty. No, we aren't going to scream. We're going to let them think they're winning. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had to look at your own flesh and blood and realize they are measuring you for a legal coffin while you're still breathing? It's a strange, hollow feeling. It makes you want to curl up under the covers and let the dark take you. But if you've ever had to stretch a single paycheck to cover a mortgage, utility bills, and school shoes, you know that giving up is a luxury you can't afford. You don't cry. You just become very, very quiet. "What's the play, Dar?" Bernice asked, wiping her eyes with the corner of her cardigan. "We play the part," I said. "We give them exactly what they expect to see. A tired, slightly confused old woman who is easily overwhelmed. And while they're gloating over their easy victory, I'm going to build a legal wall around this house that they couldn't get through with a wrecking ball." The next morning, my silent execution began. At 8:00 a.m., after the SUV had cleared the driveway, I didn't go to the courthouse. Instead, I drove down to the medical offices on Mercy Health Boulevard. I had an appointment with Dr. Alistair Vance, a man who has monitored my blood pressure and checked my reflexes for the last 22 years. He's a meticulous man with silver hair and a quiet, formal demeanor that always made me feel safe. "Darlene," Dr. Vance said, looking up from his tablet as I sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table. "Your message sounded urgent. Is everything all right?" "I need a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, Alistair," I said, keeping my voice level. "And I need it documented, certified, and notarized today." He frowned, setting his tablet down on the rolling cart. "A cognitive evaluation? You? Darlene, you just helped coordinate the entire county probate archive transition last year. Your mind is sharper than most of my residents." "I know," I said, offering him a sad, tight smile. "But I need the paper. I need a certified affidavit stating that I am of sound mind, fully capable of managing my own physical and financial affairs, and showing absolutely zero signs of cognitive decline." Dr. Vance didn't ask any more questions. He's known me long enough to know that when Darlene Gable asks for a document, there is a very good, very serious reason for it. For the next hour, he put me through the paces. I drew clock faces, recalled lists of random words, identified obscure shapes, and answered complex logical questions. When we were finished, he printed out a 3-page report, signed it, and had his office manager, who was a licensed notary, stamp it with that heavy steel hand press. The raised seal on the paper felt like armor in my hands. From there, I drove to the downtown office of Clara Sterling. Clara was a legendary estate attorney in Lorain County, a woman who wore sharp tweed suits and possessed a mind like a steel trap. We had worked together on hundreds of probate cases over 3 decades. When I walked into her office, she didn't offer me a generic greeting. She took one look at my green ledger binder and pointed to the leather chair across from her desk. Who is trying to steal what, Darlene? I laid it all out for her. The credit card judgments, the commercial loan application using my home as collateral, the forged guardianship petition. Clara's eyes narrowed as she scanned the documents, her pen tapping a rhythmic, angry beat against her mahogany desk. "This is disgusting," Clara said, her voice dropping an octave. "It's a classic equity grab. They want to get themselves appointed as your guardians, which gives them control over your real estate. Then they'll transfer the deed to their LLC, take out the commercial loan, and leave you with nothing but a court-ordered room in a state-run facility when the business goes under." "I know," I said. "So how do we stop them without triggering a premature court battle?" Clara smiled, a slow, predatory expression that made me glad she was on my side. "We build a fortress. First, we draft a revocable living trust. We'll call it the Darlene Gable Living Trust. We transfer the deed of this house from you, as an individual, to you, as the trustee of the trust. We name Bernice as your successor trustee, completely bypassing Jason." "And the guardianship petition?" I asked. "We file a preemptive declaration of guardian in the event of later incompetence or need," Clara explained, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "In this document, you explicitly state that if a court ever deems you incompetent, you designate Bernice as your guardian, and you explicitly forbid the appointment of Jason or Chloe. We also file a caveat against guardianship with the probate clerk's office. If anyone, including Jason's attorney, attempts to file a petition regarding your capacity, the court system will automatically freeze the filing and trigger an immediate, mandatory hearing. And because we have Dr. Vance's notarized evaluation from today, their petition will be dead on arrival." "How long to get the deed recorded?" I asked. "I'll have my clerk run it down to the recorder's office right now," Clara said, her eyes flashing. "Eugene is still the county recorder, right? He'll index it before the office closes today." By 3:00 p.m., my house was no longer mine. It belonged to the trust. I was the trustee, but on paper, the ownership structure had shifted. If Jason and Chloe ran a standard title search, they would see a change, but they were too arrogant to look. They assumed I was just a frightened old woman waiting for them to take the reins. I drove back to Lorraine, the rain still falling, washing the autumn leaves into the gutters. When I got home, I immediately went to work on the domestic front. I cleaned the house. But I didn't use the expensive organic cleaners Chloe had demanded. I used white vinegar, water, and lemon oil, the cheap, pungent recipe my grandmother had taught me. The sharp, sour scent of vinegar filled the hallway, a deliberate challenge disguised as obedience. I took down my favorite hand-painted ceramic plates from the kitchen wall, the ones Arthur had bought me on our 10th anniversary in Niagara Falls, and packed them into a cardboard box. I did the same with my collection of vintage glass bottles that sat on the windowsill, catching the afternoon light. I carried the boxes across the lawn to Bernice's garage, hiding my history away from their greedy hands. In their place, I went to the Goodwill on Oberlin Avenue and bought the ugliest, most cluttered plastic knickknacks I could find. A chipped ceramic cat with a creepy stare, a dusty plastic flower arrangement in a faded plastic vase. I set them prominently on the living room mantel, right where Chloe would see them. Let them think I was losing my taste. Let them think my mind was getting cluttered, just like they wanted. At 5:30 p.m., I started dinner. I made a massive pot of cabbage rolls, thick, heavy, and smelling strongly of boiled cabbage and canned tomato sauce. It was the kind of old-school working-class comfort food that Chloe's organic, sugar-free palate would despise. But it was cheap, and it was filling. When the garage door rumbled open at 6:15 p.m., I was standing at the stove, a worn dish towel draped over my shoulder, stirring the pot. Chloe walked in first. She stopped dead in her tracks, her nose wrinkling in immediate disgust. "What is that smell?" she gasped, waving her hand in front of her face. "It smells like a high school cafeteria in here." "Good evening, Chloe," I said, offering her a sweet, slightly vacant smile. "I made cabbage rolls. It's Jason's favorite. I remember how he used to eat 3 of them after his Little League games." Jason walked in behind her, looking exhausted, his shoulders slumped. He looked at the pot, then at the ugly ceramic cat on the mantel, then at me. "Mom, What is that thing on the fireplace? And why does the house smell like vinegar? Oh, I was just cleaning, honey, I said, letting my voice pitch slightly higher, adding a touch of breathy hesitation to my words. I couldn't find the organic spray Chloe wanted. My eyes have been playing tricks on me lately, and I must have misplaced the list. But the vinegar works just fine, doesn't it? My mother always used it. Chloe shot Jason a sharp, triumphant look. It was a look that said, "See? She's losing it. She's forgetting things. It's happening just like we thought." "It's fine, Darlene," Chloe said, her voice dropping into that patronizing, overly loud tone people use when they think they're speaking to someone who isn't fully there. "We'll just have to help you keep track of things better. Jason, why don't you help your mother set the table? We need to have a serious talk about the future." "Of course," Jason muttered, avoiding my eyes as he reached for the chipped Corelle plates. I turned back to my pot of cabbage rolls, the steam rising to damp my glasses. I smiled into the boiling tomato sauce. They thought they were setting the stage for my quiet eviction. They thought they were gathering the evidence they needed to lock me away. But they didn't know that every step they took was bringing them closer to the edge of a cliff, and I had already greased the tracks. For 3 days, I played the part of the fading, compliant mother. I wore my cardigan slightly lopsided. I let my voice trail off mid-sentence during breakfast, staring out the window at the gray waters of Lake Erie as if I were searching for a memory that had drifted off from the shore. I saw the way Chloe smirked at Jason over her egg whites. I saw the relief in Jason's eyes, the cowardly relief of a man who convinces himself that his betrayal is actually an act of mercy. They thought the old house, the damp cold of Lorraine, and the weight of my years had finally broken my spirit. They had no idea I was just waiting for Thursday. Thursday was the night of their celebratory dinner. Jason had proudly announced that they were hosting Preston Blake, the principal investor of a major Cleveland redevelopment group, along with their personal attorney, Donald Finch. "We're finalizing the partnership for the West Side commercial project, Mom," Jason had said, his chest puffed out as he paced my small living room. "This is the big leagues. We need everything to be absolutely perfect. We're having a high-end catering service deliver the food, but we need you to, we need you to look presentable and maybe stay in the background once the business talk starts. You know how these high-level meetings can get, very technical." "Of course, Jason," I had murmured, wiping down the counter with my vinegar-soaked rag. "I'll stay out of your way. I wouldn't want to confuse any of those big technical words." Chloe had smiled, a cold, victorious curve of her lips. "Thank you, Darlene. It's for the best." When Thursday evening arrived, the rain was coming down in sheets, slapping against the kitchen windows. The caterers arrived at 5, delivering silver trays of tiny, delicate appetizers that looked like they'd blow away in a stiff breeze, along with a dry, expensive Cabernet. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Preston Blake was a tall, silver-haired man who wore a tailored cashmere overcoat that dripped rain onto my braided rug without a word of apology. Beside him was Donald Finch, a man I recognized from my decades at the courthouse. Finch was a small, ferret-like attorney with a reputation for representing the kind of people who sued their own siblings over a parent's silver collection. He smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap mints, and his leather briefcase was scuffed at the corners. "Welcome, welcome," Chloe gushed, her voice hovering an octave higher than usual as she took Blake's coat. "We are so thrilled to have you in our temporary quarters. It's a bit rustic, but it has charm." "It's a roof," Blake said, his eyes scanning the low ceilings of my living room with a practiced, dismissive appraisal. "Let's get to the paperwork, Jason. I have a flight to Chicago at 10. They gathered around my pine dining table, the very table where I had helped Jason with his long division, the table where Arthur and I had sat in silence the night we paid off the 30-year mortgage. Chloe had covered it with a sleek, modern gray runner, but she couldn't hide the deep, familiar ring stains from my old coffee mugs. I stood in the kitchen doorway, wearing my best Sunday dress, a simple, navy blue knit that had seen its share of wash cycles, and my faded yellow apron. "Darlene," Chloe called out, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Could you bring over the wine and the glasses, please? And then we'll need some privacy." I loaded the glasses onto a small silver tray. I walked into the dining room, my steps slow and deliberate. As I set the glasses down, Donald Finch looked up. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized me. "Darlene Gable?" Finch said, his voice dropping. "I didn't realize—" "Jason, this is your mother?" "Yes, Donald," Jason said quickly, brushing it off. "My mother. She's retired now. Mom, why don't you head upstairs? We have a lot of legal jargon to go through." "Oh, don't worry about me, Jason," I said, my voice clear and steady, devoid of the soft, breathy hesitation I'd been using all week. "I'm quite familiar with legal jargon. After 30 years in the probate office, I find it rather comforting." I stayed right where I was, my hands folded over my apron. If you've ever had to sit there and watch someone try to sell the coat off your back while you're still wearing it, you know the absolute stillness that comes over your bones. It's not fear. It's the quiet, heavy weight of a trap that is about to spring. I know some of you reading this have felt that cold hand around your heart, wondering if you should just let them take what they want to keep the peace. But let me tell you something. Peace without dignity is just a slow surrender. And Darlene Gable does not surrender. Jason frowned, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Mom, please. We're in the middle of a major transaction. Mr. Blake is a very busy man." "I'm sure he is," I said, looking directly at Preston Blake. "Which is why I'm surprised he's wasting his time with two people who are currently being evicted from their Cleveland apartment for $9,000 in back rent." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the steady, heavy patter of the rain against the window pane. Chloe's face turned an ugly, mottled red. "What did you just say? Darlene, you are clearly confused. Jason, I told you she's been having these episodes. Her cognitive state is declining rapidly." "Is it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I turned toward the hallway and raised my voice slightly. "Bernice, you can bring them in now." The kitchen door opened, and Bernice walked in. She wasn't carrying appetizers. She was carrying my green ledger binder along with a stack of heavy manila envelopes. She stood beside me, her jaw set, her eyes locked on Jason with a look of pure, neighborly disappointment. "Thanks, Bernice," I said, taking the green ledger and placing it squarely in the middle of the dining table, right on top of Chloe's sleek gray runner. "What is the meaning of this?" Preston Blake demanded, his voice dropping into a cold, hard register as he looked from Jason to me. "Jason? What is she talking about?" "Nothing, Mr. Blake," Jason stammered, his hands shaking as he stood up, knocking his chair back a few inches. "My mother she's not well. We're actually in the process of securing guardianship for her. She's been showing signs of severe dementia. Donald has the petition right here." Donald Finch looked like he wanted to slide under my braided rug and disappear into the floorboards. He knew me. He knew my reputation. And more importantly, he knew what happened to lawyers who filed fraudulent documents in Lorain County. "Actually, Mr. Blake," I said, opening the green ledger to the first tab, "let me show you the reality of the partners you're about to climb into bed with." I pulled out the certified copies of Chloe's 3 active credit card judgments and slid them across the table toward Blake. "Here are $38,000 in unpaid judgments against your co-partner, Chloe Gable." I flipped to the next tab. "Here is the active suspension from the state of Ohio for Jason's consulting firm, meaning his business has no legal standing to enter into any commercial contracts whatsoever." Preston Blake picked up the papers, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the official court stamps. The silence in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. "And finally," I said, looking directly at Donald Finch, whose face had gone completely white, "we have this, a draft of a petition for the appointment of a guardian, claiming that I, Darlene Gable, am suffering from cognitive decline. It's accompanied by a medical evaluation bearing a very clumsy photocopy of Dr. Alistair Vance's signature." "Mom, stop!" Jason yelled, his voice cracking. "You don't know what you're doing. You're ruining everything." "No, Jason," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than any scream. "I am saving my home. The home your father and I built. The home you tried to steal." I turned back to Donald Finch. "Donald, I filed a caveat against guardianship with the probate clerk's office at 9:15 on Tuesday morning. I also filed a certified, notarized cognitive evaluation from Dr. Vance himself, dated this week, confirming my perfect mental health. If you attempt to file that forged petition, I will personally hand this file to the Disciplinary Council of the Ohio State Bar Association before the ink is dry. You'll be disbarred by Christmas." Finch didn't even hesitate. He reached out, grabbed his leather briefcase, and stood up so fast he knocked his water glass over. "I'm out," he muttered, not looking at Jason or Chloe. "I told you two this was a high-risk move. I'm withdrawing as your counsel, immediately." "Finch, wait!" Jason pleaded. But the lawyer was already grabbing his coat from the hallway and bursting out into the rainy night, the front door slamming shut behind him. Preston Blake slowly rose from his chair. He looked at the financial judgments, then at the forged petition, and finally at Jason, who looked small, defeated, and utterly exposed. "You told me this property was unencumbered, Jason," Blake said, his voice dripping with venom. "You told me your mother was a willing, silent partner who wanted to liquefy her assets for your venture. You lied to me. You tried to drag my firm into a fraudulent equity skimming scheme." "Mr. Blake, please," Chloe cried, her voice desperate, her manicured fingers clutching at his sleeve. "We can explain. We can restructure the deal. The house is still worth—" "The house," I interrupted, sliding a certified copy of the newly recorded deed across the table, "belongs to the Darlene Gable Living Trust. I am the sole trustee. My successor trustee is Bernice, right here. My son has zero legal interest in this property, and he never will." Preston Blake didn't say another word. He grabbed his cashmere coat, gave me a brief, respectful nod of his head, and walked out of my house, leaving the door wide open to the cold, wet Ohio wind. Jason collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands, his expensive silk tie finally falling completely askew. Chloe stood beside him, her hands trembling, her eyes darting around my dining room, as if searching for a way out of a room that had suddenly grown very, very small. The rain kept drumming against the glass, but inside, the air was perfectly clear. The silence that settled over my dining room was heavy, thick with the sharp scent of boiled cabbage, vinegar, and the damp wool of the coats that had just walked out of my life. Jason sat slumped in the cherrywood chair, the one my late husband Arthur had repaired with wood glue and 2 brass screws after Jason fell off it when he was 10 years old. His hands were still covering his face, his fingers twitching against his temples. Chloe stood frozen beside him, her eyes darting from my green ledger to the certified deed, her mouth working silently like a fish gasping for air. Bernice didn't say a word. She just quietly walked over to the front door, closed it firmly against the damp October wind, and slid the heavy oak deadbolt into place. The sharp clack of that lock sounded like a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. "You ruined me," Jason whispered, his voice cracking as he finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, but they weren't wet with tears of regret. They were sharp with the anger of a spoiled child who had finally been told no. "Mr. Blake was my last chance, Mom. That development deal was going to put us on the map. We were going to be set for life, and you threw it all away because of some stupid, bitter grudge." "A grudge, Jason?" I asked, my voice as calm as a frozen pond. I walked over to the table and touched the edge of my green ledger binder. "You brought a forged document into my house to declare me incompetent. You tried to turn my home, the only thing your father and I worked 30 years to keep, into collateral for a high-risk gamble. You didn't just try to borrow my house, Jason. You tried to erase my life. You tried to make me a ghost in my own kitchen so you could sign my name on a dotted line." Chloe stepped forward, her expensive leather boots squeaking on the linoleum. "We were going to take care of you, Darlene. We were going to pay for a nice place, a luxury senior community. You wouldn't have had to worry about a thing. No utility bills, no mowing the lawn, no drafty old rooms." "A nice place," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air between us. "A nice place with structured hours and a nurse to check if I've taken my pills, while you and Jason spent the equity of my life on $5 lattes and high-rise rent you couldn't afford. No, Chloe, you didn't want to take care of me. You wanted me out of the way so you could clean out the register." I looked at Jason. My heart ached, a deep, dull throb that felt like an old bone injury in cold weather. I wanted to reach out, to smooth his hair like I did when he had a fever, to tell him it was all going to be okay. But that would be a lie, and the time for lies was over. "The suitcases are upstairs," I said quietly. "You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to pack them and leave this house." "Mom, please," Jason groaned, his voice dropping into a desperate whine. "We don't have anywhere to go. The eviction notice. We have to be out of the Cleveland apartment by Monday. We don't have the first and last month's rent for a new place. We're broke." "Then you'll do what I did when your father left us," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You'll find a cheap room. You'll take whatever job is hiring. You'll count your pennies. You'll stretch your meals. And you will learn the value of a dollar you actually earned. But you will not do it under my roof, and you will certainly not do it on my dime. I know some of you are looking at me right now, maybe feeling a little chill in your chest. You're thinking, 'Darlene, how could you turn your own boy out into the cold rain? He's your only child.' Family is supposed to stick together, no matter what. If you've ever been treated like a burden by those who should love you, this one is for you. Stay with me. Because let me tell you something, I learned in 30 years of watching families tear each other apart over wills and estates. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for a person is to let them hit the bottom. If you keep holding them up, if you keep letting them steal your peace to feed their pride, they will eventually pull you under with them. I loved Jason enough to carry him through the hard times when he was a boy, but I love myself enough now to refuse to let him drown me as a man. The next morning at 8:45 a.m., the rain had cleared, leaving the sky a pale, washed-out blue over Lake Erie. Jason and Chloe dragged their rose-gold suitcases down the wooden stairs. There was no grand farewell. Chloe didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on her phone, her face tight and bitter, her heels clicking aggressively on the porch steps. Jason paused at the door. He looked smaller, older. The illusion of his high-flying success stripped away like cheap wallpaper. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Mom," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the passing traffic on Henderson Drive. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness right now, Jason," I said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm asking for your respect. And until you can find some of that for me, and for yourself, we don't have much to talk about." He turned and walked down the driveway, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the wet gravel. I watched their SUV pull out onto the road, its red taillights disappearing around the bend. 6 months have passed since that rainy October night. The heavy snows of Lorraine have finally melted, and the first green shoots of my daffodils are starting to push their way through the dark Ohio soil. I still live in my 2-bedroom bungalow. It's quiet here, the kind of quiet that lets you hear the mourning doves nesting under the eaves in the early morning. Bernice and I spend our Tuesdays sitting on the porch, drinking hot tea from my old ceramic mugs and watching the cargo ships slowly crawl across the horizon of the lake. We don't talk about Jason much, but she knows. She always knows. Jason and Chloe are living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Parma. It's not a luxury high-rise, and it doesn't have a view of the skyline, but the rent is within their budget. Jason had to close his consulting firm. He's working as an assistant manager at a logistics company near the docks, earning a steady, honest salary. Chloe is teaching corporate training seminars. They are paying off their debts dollar by dollar the hard way. Last week my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It wasn't a demand and it wasn't a list of rules. It was a text from Jason. "Happy Easter, Mom. I hope the weather is nice by the lake. We're doing okay." I stared at the screen for a long time, the warmth of the spring sun streaming through my kitchen window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. I didn't write back a long, emotional paragraph. I didn't invite them over for dinner. The boundary is still there, solid and clear, like the concrete foundation of my house. But I did text him back. "Happy Easter, Jason. The daffodils are coming up. Glad to hear you're doing well." It's not a perfect ending. There are no tearful hugs, no grand declarations of love, no magical restoration of the bond we used to have. But it's a real ending. The door is not locked and bolted forever, but it is closed, and I am the only one who holds the key. I sit at my pine table now, my hands resting on my green ledger. The house smells of lemon wax and fresh air, not vinegar or boiled cabbage. I survived the storm, not because I was louder or meaner than those who tried to hurt me, but because I knew where the foundation was laid. If you're sitting at your own kitchen table tonight, feeling the weight of a family that treats your love like a resource to be mined, I want you to remember this. You are allowed to build a wall. You are allowed to say no to the people who think your age, your kindness, or your sacrifice makes you weak. Love is a gift, not a line item in a budget. and you have every right to protect the roof over your head and the peace in your heart.